Good evening, traveller of time. Pull your cloak tighter, feel the warmth of the hearth against the chill of night, and settle into your bed of blankets and quiet thoughts. This is the tale of meat and mead, of dried fish and half-baked bread, of raw onions and watery wine. It's a story told not in clashing steel, but in the slosh of a soup pot. Tonight, we set out on a journey not of kings or crusades, but of campfires and kitchens, because while battles were fought with swords and strategy, they were also powered by something a little less glamorous food. And what the warriors of ancient times ate was not always as glorious as the stories that followed them. You've heard of them, haven't you? In the north, Viking warriors were feasting on dried fish, barley, porridge, and ale. Warriors weren't just fed, they were fortified with stories, with laughter, with ritual. A simple bite of salted pork could become part of a legend. But for now, let this first bite of history nourish your curiosity and lull you gently toward sleep. A bowl of stew, shared before battle, could become sacred. Lots of ale. Feel the heat on your face. Hear the distant murmur of soldiers sharing bread and fears. Smell the earthy stew bubbling, the temps of wine, the distant neigh of a restless warhorse. In these quiet hours before battle, food became solace, and sometimes the only certainty in a world of blood and banners. Ale was practically a food group. They'd bake flatbreads over open flames, sometimes smeared with rendered fat. Not exactly keto, but definitely high energy. In cold climates, calories were armor, and drinking, that was celebration, ritual, and rowdy amusement all at once. If you couldn't handle your drink, you weren't much of a shield, brother. The peak of discipline and military might, but their food, rats, roots, whatever was edible in the battlefield's margins. Hunger didn't care about honor. You could be a knight with a gleaming sword and still have to scrape burnt oats from the bottom of a pot. Not so mighty, or camped in victory. That's when the real feasts began. Roasted lamb, honeyed fruits, barrels of mead and wine, laughter booming through smoky halls, the clash of mugs, the telling of exaggerated battle tales, and maybe a lute strumming off-key in the background. The infamous Spartan black broth was a grim concoction made from pigs, blood, vinegar, and herbs. Soldiers drank it, not for the taste it was as comforting as drinking a battlefield, but because it was believed to toughen the spirit. Taste buds, on the other hand, were left to fend for themselves. So dim the lights. Rest your head, and join me as we tiptoe through the smoky encampments, bustling feasting halls, and grimy campaign trenches of history's warriors. Roam the empire of roads and legions. Dried meat strips tucked under saddles would slowly warm and soften during a day's ride. Fermented mare's milk kumi was a staple. Yes, sour horse milk, not your average latte, but it got the job done. Their soldiers marched great distances, carrying rations in satchels that jangled like miniature pantries. A Roman legionary's staples included dried beans and garum fermented fish sauce, so pungent it might qualify as an act of war. Romans loved it. You might not. Let's begin at the very starter. The eve of battle. Imagine a group of warriors, hunched near a flickering campfire, their armor stacked beside them, the stench of sweat, leather, and smoke heavy in the air. They're tired, their feet are blistered, their cloaks are damp, but still there is one small joy they cling to before marching into camp. And this wasn't some grand royal banquet. No, it was often a cracked bowl of millet porridge, or a chunk of hard bread softened with broth. Contrary to Hollywood drama, Most ancient warriors weren't tearing into roasted boar with tankards of ale sloshing from golden goblets. More often than not, they were gnawing on salted meat so tough it could double as a shield, a kind of sacred rhythm to it. The Celts, for instance, believed in the symbolism of the communal feast. They gathered around fires, their meals an act of bonding, of courage building. The biggest warrior often received the champion's portion, a particularly prized piece of meat, though disputes over who deserved it sometimes led to brawls before the actual battle. You'd need more than just a sword to get through. It'd need teeth like a warhorse. Still, there was ritual in the eating. Then there were the Spartans. And what of the Romans? Meanwhile, even among the Mongols, fierce horsemen of the steppe, the food reflected their nomadic genius. But let's not romanticize it too much. Many ancient warriors ate whatever they could scavenge, and then you've stretched your legs in the wooden halls of ancient warrior feasts, warmed by the hearths and surrounded by the rich smell of roasting meat. But let's pull back the tapestry now, because while it's tempting to imagine warriors always dining in torchlit splendor with goblets in hand, the truth unsurprisingly is far grittier. Into the field, onto the muddy, arrow-strewn fringes of war, because even the mightiest had to eat, and not every meal came with a bard or a boar. A line of half-armored men chew stale bread, while chickens cluck nervously nearby, unsure if they're pets or provisions. The air smells faintly of sweat, wool, and wet earth. This, dear listener, is the breakfast of the marching soldier. His pouch carries salted pork, dried peas, a bit of rough barley bread, and if he's lucky, a flask of ale. This isn't lunch, it's a gamble. Will he cook it? Maybe. If he has fire and time, convenient, shelf-stable, and profoundly dull, but with a bit of water or warm tea poured over it, it's swelled into something soft and edible if you were generous with your definitions. Otherwise, it's cold pork jerky and a handful of hope. Their food was often dried fish, root vegetables like turnips, and a flat bread made from barley and oats. If a cow or sheep had to be sacrificed for a stew, the bones were boiled until they cracked open with marrow. Sometimes even that wasn't enough. Fanned men would drink broth, thickened with blood, salted until it stung the lips. Yes, slimy, wriggling in life, but surprisingly portable once salted and sun. A dented pot simmering over a low flame, a communal spoon passed from hand to hand, bread dipped in grease, cheese wrapped in cloth and slightly spoiled, but still clutched like gold. There were no vitamins, no balanced macros, only hunger, habit, and hope. Some believed ill had spiritual energy, that its slippery body could confuse demons. Consider the Persian warrior's meal kit: bread, dates, dried lamb, and yogurt balls hardened into dense, chalky spheres. They'd tenderize dried meat by placing it under their saddles as they rode, letting the jostle of the journey break it down. One of survival, one of grit, and yes, even one of strange, stubborn joy. Native American warriors boiled cattails and pine bark. During long sieges, some medieval soldiers were reduced to eating boiled leather, rats, or grimly fallen comrades. Starvation knew no chivalry. To draw strength, not from flavor, but from tradition, from repetition. A Roman might say, "I've eaten the same bread since Hispania." These weren't standard meals, but morale boost ceremonial indulgences to remind soldiers what they were fighting for. In ancient China, soldiers were sometimes given dumplings shaped like ears, in honor of victories, or strange jelly candies molded in the shapes of divine creatures blessed before being consumed. A Mongol? This milk is the milk of my father's horse. A samurai? I carry the rice of my ancestors. Yesadal jerky? Chewy, salty, slightly sweaty delicious. Probably not, but effective. His fingers stained with oil from preserved olives. Around him, the distant whisper of enemy horses. He chews in silence, not for pleasure, but for a biscuit older than your boot, a bit of cheese wrapped in waxcloth, a slosh of vinegar water, a piece of salted eel that tastes like the ocean's grudge. These weren't just calories, they were echoes of home, pieces of culture carried in a pouch. They might roast onions, eat barley cakes, or dip cheese in honey, but one strange soup stands out: black broth, or melas. This Spartan staple was made of pig's blood, vinegar, salt, and boiled pork. Even other Greeks found it horrifying. A visiting diplomat once gagged, calling it a potion fit only for those who have lost their sense of taste. But the Spartans believed. It gave strength and perhaps a touch of fearlessness. And so much weirder. Roman legionaries carried a ration known as busha latimer, kind of jaw-defying hard biscuit made to last weeks. You didn't bite into it. You gnawed, soaked it in vinegar, or cracked it apart with the pommel of your dagger. Calling it bread was generous. It was closer to weaponized flour, and yet it was cherished, because the alternative was an empty belly. Let's follow these same warriors beyond the banquet table, out onto the road. Imagine the dawn rising over a damp and misty plain. They drank Poscar mix of water, vinegar, and sometimes herbs. It was tangy, sour, a bit alarming to modern tongues, but it killed bacteria and kept you alive. Plus, it made the bushalatum slightly less salt. In many ancient armies, a warrior's field ration was not much of a feast. But wait, yes, the Romans didn't swig sweet wine on campaign. Some medieval armies developed a field favorite, panis militaris, a precursor to the iron-hard hut. Add some dried onion, maybe a pickled egg, if the quartermaster was feeling generous. And that was dinner. Soldiers were warned not to eat too quickly. It wasn't just bad for digestion. It was dangerous to one's jaw. Now let's trudge across time and look in on a medieval foot soldier. And when time was short, or fires forbidden to avoid detection, meals got even stranger. Meanwhile, Japanese samurai often carried huge dried rice cakes mixed with millet or bean paste. But field food wasn't only about survival. It had symbolism. Let's pause for a moment and picture it. And a commanded soldier sitting under a dusty moon, breaking his bread beside a fireless camp. And what about the Vikings? You might think of them as fire-randell men. But on campaign, things got lean. The Mongols were perhaps the most shockingly inventive. Their warriors could ride for days with only fermented mares, milk, dried curds, and hard mutton. And just as strange were the ancient Greek hoplites. Their meals were infused with ritual and rank. Fast forward again, and we find crusaders munching on dried fruits, honey cakes, and salted eel. Now, picture the forgotten detail of these battlefield meals. Let's not forget the emergency rations. Roman armies, when desperate, chewed acorns, wild roots, or bitter herbs. And amid all this, the body learned to adapt. There's something haunting in that. Food on the battlefield was a memory, a tether to home, a talisman against fear. And still, there was room for occasional delight. Festivals before campaigns might offer roast, goat, honey wine, even spiced stews. As you lie still, listening, Imagine yourself holding one of those ancient meals. Not exactly fine dining, but in every hardened crust and soured drink there was a warrior's story. So now we leave the polished trenchers and goblets behind, and step into the mud-caked boots of warriors on campaign when supplies ran thin. Options were grim, and dinner might just crawl away before you caught it. Warriors on the move had to carry their rations with them, and it was rarely glamorous. Imagine the clatter of pots slung over horses, sacks of grain hoisted over shoulders, and bundles of dried meat tied to belts. These men were nothing if not organized. They marched with discipline, pitched identical camps, and carried a standard ration kit in their packs. At the heart of it all, grain. Lots of grain. They raided and settled far from home, and while they were expert sailors, they didn't exactly bring a chef aboard the longship. Not exactly a smoothie, but rich in calories, and, to their tastes, quite satisfying. And if food got scarce, well, a little seal meat or scavenged roots might have to do. On campaign, Viking warriors ate what could be easily preserved or quickly prepared. A grim meal, but the view was decent. Think smoked fish, dried reindeer meat, and dense, hearty bread made from rye or oats. Genghis Khan's horsemen didn't just ride. They lived on horseback, and they had a diet tailored to that very life. These moments weren't the norm, but they were grim reminders of what a campaign diet could mean when things fell apart. Their food was portable, calorie-rich, and occasionally unsettling. Add a few figs and a little oil, and suddenly you've got yourself a rustic lunch that wouldn't look out of place in a modern picnic basket. They ate to endure, yes, but occasionally they dined with dignity. Medieval Islamic armies, for instance, had better logistics and made use of rice, dried fruits, and preserved meats, with spicy portable meals that actually had flavor and variety. They were lucky to get a chunk of stale bread, some hard cheese, or a bit of dried legume mash. Meals were eaten with hands, shared from a single pot, and sometimes cooked over fires fueled with dung or straw. Behind every sword swing was an empty stomach. Behind every charge, the longing for soup. There were no napkins, no plates, and certainly no second helpings. But just as often, it was growling bellies, chipped teeth from hard biscuits, and a whispered hope for anything that didn't taste like oat paste. Spiced lamb with dried apricots and lentils. Now we're talking. Not heroic, not glamorous, but vital. Soldiers sometimes turned to foraging, or what you might call historically sanctioned looting. Chickens disappeared mysteriously from villages. Unpicked apples vanished from trees. Grain stores, once protected, became fair game. War, after all, wasn't just a matter of battlefield glory, it was also about outlasting hunger. Yes, you heard that right. In emergencies, a small incision was made in the horse's neck to collect a cup or two of blood rich in nutrients, and believe it or not fatal to the animal. You could sip it warm or mix it with milk, and dreaming not of glory but of stews, back home of wives and mothers cooking lentils with garlic, of the smell of bread rising from hearth ovens, these memories were nourishment too. Was it delicious? Probably not. But was it effective? Absolutely. Your stomach churns, your knees ache, and your body cries out for salt and meat. And still, the march continues. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was morale. It was hope. It was everything. Chief among their staples was arag, fermented mare's milk, slightly alcoholic, slightly fizzy, and definitely an acquired taste. Arag was both hydration and celebration in a leather sack. They might carry sour whey or buttermilk in wooden flasks, and if they were feeling fancy, a little dried fruit, maybe some apples or cloudberries picked along the way. The Mongols were fond of dried meat called borts, which was essentially ultra-dehydrated beef or mutton, pounded thin and left to dry in the wind and sun. Borts could last for months, rehydrated in broth or tea. It made a surprisingly nourishing soup. Wheat or barley, which they'd grind into meal and cook into pulsa, thick, bland porridge that could be eaten hot or cold. Add some oil, maybe a dash of vinegar, and congratulations, you've made Roman oat. In the Crusader camps of the Levant, soldiers from Europe encountered spices and grains they'd never seen before. Lentils, dates, flatbreads, and even garbanzo beans, chickpeas found their way into stews and rations. Suddenly, the gruel had company. Yet even then, supply lines were fragile, and hunger often shadowed every siege and skirmish. If they were lucky, they might get some dried fruit or a sliver of salted pork. But the average diet was about as beige as a stone wall. This wasn't a picnic, it was strategic, rationed survival. There was something reliable in its simplicity. It didn't spoil quickly. It was filling, and it left just enough room for a soldier to dream of the next wine ration. And what did a Roman legionnaire, a Mongol horseman, or a Viking raider pack for lunch? Not a protein bar or trail mix, that's for sure. Let's begin with Roman legionnaires, whose military campaigns stretched from North Africa to the chilly hills of Britain. And yet, that humble pools kept entire legions alive and marching. Now travel north, across wind-swept coasts and freezing rivers, and you'll find the Vikings, equally mobile and just as hungry. But here's the bizarre parts. Sometimes they fermented their way into a curdled, sour drink called, imagine warm yogurt gone rogue. One can almost picture a Viking sitting on the edge of a rocky coastline, chewing on hard bread that could double as a weapon, reminiscing about hearth-cooked stews and mead halls as waves crashed nearby. Next, let's glance east to the Mongol warriors, masters of endurance and speed. But when it came to protein, they didn't mess around. And here's a travel tip from 13th century Mongolia. If your horse gets injured, the blood can be tapped for sustenance. Medieval campaign diets weren't just shaped by necessity, they were reflections of the land. There were moments of desperation, like during the siege of Antioch in 1098, when starving crusaders reportedly resorted to boiling grass, eating leather, or even brace-yourself cannibalism. And yet, there were bursts of ingenuity, too. The Byzantine soldiers, with their mix of Roman legacy and Eastern flair, often carried cheese, onions, bread, and wine. But let's not forget the foot soldiers, the nameless masseuse, conscripted or drafted to fight, often without pay and with barely enough rations. And when the food ran out, now imagine trying to fight in metal armor after eating boiled barley and dried lentils for weeks. There are countless untold stories of warriors who sat beside their comrades, staring into flames, chewing on jerky, passing around a skin of bitter wine. So the next time you watch a grand medieval battle on screen, remember that those men in chainmail probably hadn't eaten well in days. We often picture war as steel and fire. And so, from Roman pools to fermented mare's milk, from Viking dried fish to Crusader chickpeas, the warrior's campaign diet was an act of endurance all its own. Imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a battlefield. The sun is just beginning to rise behind the distant hills. Your armor creaks, your sword is heavy at your side, and your heart is pounding with what's about to come. You take a breath deep, shaky, and then you reach for a goblet of mead. That's right, because before the chaos of swords and shields, many ancient warriors began their day, not with a prayer, not with a stretch, but with a stiff drink. Wine was central to Greek life, so central that even their war councils were drenched in it. Even watered-down wine, consumed over hours, could produce a steady, warm buzz, and that warmth might have been just enough to silence the voice of fear inside a hopliter's helmet. In fact, some military strategies may have been penned while slightly sour, tangy, and not particularly appetizing, but believed to invigorate the spirit and kill off harmful microbes. It wasn't about taste, it was about utility, and maybe a little numbing. Roman soldiers had a standard issue ration of wine, not as a treat, but as a staple, before long marches, after exhausting drills, and yes, before charging into battle. On one hand, wine was sacred after all. It represented the blood of Christ. Monasteries even brewed beer. But drunkenness was considered a sin, and soldiers who overindulged before battle could be condemned for entering combat in a state of spiritual impurity. Alcohol, in this context, was less about courage and more about catharsis, a way to cope with the impossible weight of what was to come. The alcohol served multiple purposes: hydration, mild disinfection, and a tiny touch of bravery. Ale was common in Europe. It was thick, cloudy, and hearty, almost like drinkable bread. Roman accounts speak of Celtic warriors stripping naked, painting themselves with blue woad, and charging into battle howling with wine or ale on their breath. In ancient Sparta, for example, discipline was everything. A drunken soldier was a weak soldier. The Spartans trained hard, lived simply, and approached battle with cold focus. No wine, fog here, just sharp blades and sharper minds. Whether those descriptions were exaggerated propaganda or not, it's clear that alcohol played a strong role in their warrior rituals. Some staring into their cups, others laughing too loud. The scent of smoke and bread in the air, horns raised not just to victory, but to memory. Through the crackle of the fire, the slosh of wine in clay jars, the clink of cups, the stillness before the charge. To those they lost, to the courage they hoped to find. In many cases, booze was bravery, a liquid cloak against the terror of death, a communal toast to brotherhood, a quiet moment of peace before the storm. Drunkenness wasn't a flaunt, was a performance, a spiritual surrender to the battle frenzy. It filled the stomach, warmed the limbs, and made for a decent last supper. Before battle, sake could be used in purification rituals, sipped in silence as a spiritual grounding, a whisper of fear, a roar of defiance, a swallow of warmth in a world gone cold. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about becoming centered. A sip for serenity before chaos. Their wine, however, was not exactly what you'd want to serve at a dinner party. Among some warrior societies, sharing a gourd of fermented drink was a way to seal oaths and strengthen brotherhood. Imagine a circle of fighters, arms clasped, passing a jug around the fire. This tangy, lightly alcoholic beverage was a staple among steppe nomads. It provided calories, hydration, and, yes, a buzz. The Mongols believed in speed, efficiency, and shock tactics, but they also valued camaraderie. Drinking kumi before riding into battle wasn't just nourishment, it was bonding. Drinking wasn't a distraction, it was a ritual, a reminder that you weren't alone. It was strong, sometimes sour, and often mixed with herbs, seawater, or even lead for sweetnessy. And while the Greeks frowned on outright drunkenness, They embraced the idea that moderate wine could bring clarity, calm, and even courage. Some philosophers even suggested that wine opened the mind to divine inspiration. A bit of Dionysian courage before facing the Spartan phalanx sounds like a plan. In ancient dynasties, especially during the Shang and Zhou periods, alcohol was deeply tied to military ceremony. Before going into battle, generals would often make offerings of wine to ancestral spirits, seeking protection, and while many tried to keep their wits sharp, there were occasions, especially during large feasts before campaigns, where the line between ceremonial toasts and a few too many was delightfully blurry. But to a Viking, a Roman, or a Babylonian spearman, a drink before war was often considered spiritual fuel, a way to calm the nerves, connect with the gods, or maybe just stop thinking too hard about how likely you were to die before lunch. In fact, alcohol wasn't just a celebratory indulgence. The fire crackles, the hounds nap in the corner, and the smell of roasted venison and sweat lingers thick in the air. Some historians believe these warriors may have used substance, possibly mushrooms or herbs, to induce their frenzied state, but for many others, it was good old mead, fermented fire in a horned cup, believed to summon the spirit of Odin himself. They weren't just fighting. They were performing a sacred rite. Here warriors drink hornfuls of mead not just after battle, but before. Mead, brewed from honey, was more than a sweet drink. It was the drink of gods and heroes. And for the Norse, going into battle, a little mead buzzed, was less about dulling fear and more about transforming into something divine, something berserk. In many ancient cultures, it was practically battle prep. It might sound strange to us now, after all. Swinging a sword while tipsy doesn't seem like a great idea. Let's begin our journey at the long wooden tables of a Norse mead hall. Ah, yes, the berserkers, those legendary Viking warriors who were said to fight in a trance-like fury, seemingly immune to pain and driven by primal rage. Now shift the scene. We're in ancient Greece, where the soldiers aren't chugging mead, but sipping diluted wine from ceramic craters. The Greeks diluted their wine with water, usually 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. But don't mistake that for weakness. Then there were the Romans, masters of order, law, and legions, and, naturally, of wine. This wasn't a luxury, it was fuel. Soldiers drank it daily, and the Romans didn't just drink wine. They sometimes indulged in a concoction known as posca, mix of vinegar, water, and wine residue. Across the world, in China, warriors drank Miller-based wine. Even in Africa, palm wine and millet beers played ceremonial roles before war. But of course, not everyone approved. In medieval Europe, the church had a rather conflicted view of drinking. Still, that didn't stop some crusaders from partaking in strong ale the night before battle. Some chronicles from the Crusades describe evenings where soldiers drank deeply, shouted prayers, sang hymns, and wept knowing that the next day might be their last. In Japan, samurai culture emphasized discipline, restraint, and focus. But even here, sake rice wine played a role in martial life. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, Mongol warriors were known to drink fermented mare's milk. And let's not forget the Celts. Oh, the Celts. Fierce, flamboyant, and fond of drink. Now, of course, not every warrior culture embraced pre-battle drinking. Some viewed it as dangerous, even dishonorable. But across the broader world, the story was different. Sometimes it was all of those things. And as the night deepens and the story lingers, you might imagine them, the warriors of old, sitting by firelight, because for all the shields and swords, for all the armor and honor, there was something deeply human in that shared drink. Now, let your mind drift gently with them. In the next chapter, we'll step away from the horn and goblet and into the more curious world of food as propaganda, and communion where banquet tables held more secrets than strategy scrolls. If you've been listening this far, curled up in your blanket while picturing warriors gnawing on hard bread or sipping courage from a clay cup, then let me now lead you into a far stranger corner of ancient military life. Tonight, let's talk about food, not as nutrition, or comfort, or even morale, but as theater, as strategy, as subtle manipulation. Was dinner, because, believe it or not, one of the most powerful weapons in a ruler's arsenal. And tomorrow morning, you're going to be asked to charge face first into a wall of spears. You're not particularly excited about it. Then, just before nightfall, word spreads through camp. The king is hosting a feast. This is the moment a leader whispers to you without saying a word that he sees you, that you're part of something glorious, that your belly should be full of loyalty before your mouth starts complaining. Imagine this. You're a weary soldier, your sandals are falling apart, your tunic smells like everything you've walked through, and nothing screamed "you are valuable to me" louder than roasted meat served beside a fire the night before you might die. And so, Alexander didn't just lead with tactics, he led with turkey legs. A proper feast. Tables, torches, spiced meat. Why not vinegar, water? Not barley gruel, but wine. Roasted lamb, honeyed bread, figs stuffed with walnuts. In ancient Rome, emperors understood the optics of the plate. How much food is enough to buy loyalty, but not so much that soldiers get lazy. Feed them, and you've earned favor, but feed them too well, and suddenly they remember what comfort feels like. Panem et circenses bread and circuses wasn't just a snarky comment from the poet. It was a whole political doctrine. Before significant campaigns, particularly during the Crusades or Islamic conquests, it was not uncommon to hold communal prayers followed by food distribution. Bread dipped in oil, lentil stews, dried fruits. These weren't lavish feasts, but they were symbolic, a reminder: we eat as one, we fight as one, and if need be, we fall as one. Samurai received rations based on social status and battle role. You see, a soldier with an empty stomach might question orders, but give him meat on the bone and wine in a cup, and suddenly he's too full to question, only grateful. Maybe even proud. A foot soldier might get rice balls wrapped in bamboo leaves. Meat was passed around, sometimes with a hierarchy to who got what part of the animal. The liver for the leader. If the commander could afford honeyed quail and imported olives, surely he could afford proper armor and decent tactics. Right? The heart for the bravest fighter. Symbolism roasted and served with root vegetables. A soldier who stepped out of line might not get whipped, but he might lose his meat ration. A deserter, if caught and spared, might be made to eat last, or not at all. In some cases, particularly in Roman and Byzantine contexts, soldiers were publicly demoted by being assigned civilian food porridge, crusts, no wine. A higher-ranking retainer might receive dried fish, miso, and suck. The night before a hopeless charge, or a siege that had already lasted too long, commanders would host last feasts. Feel the heat, the low murmur of voices, the occasional clink of pottery. Picture the simple joys of holding warm bread after days of walking, or the smell of roasted onion wafting through a military tent. Think of them as morale boosts and distraction wrapped in roasted duck and heavy wine. Not just food, food as armor. In these cases, meals were almost magical thinking. Eat the heart of a lion, gain its courage. During the 100 Years' War, it wasn't uncommon for nobles to throw feasts before campaigns that were deliberately public and opulent. Guests from foreign lands were sometimes invited not because anyone thought they'd fight, but because it allowed the host to display just how well-equipped and deadly their army could be, a sort of edible press release. Eat the meat of a bull, and you won't back down. A superstition, sandwich, if you will. It has a haunting idea that some warriors dined not out of celebration but because everyone knew what tomorrow would bring. But before major battles, some daimios would elevate the rations, sometimes even hosting tea ceremonies or feasts, both to show off their wealth and, more quietly, to remind everyone just who was footing the bill for their future glory. Keep the people fed, and you could keep their swords pointed at someone else. Keep the soldiers fat and entertained, and they'd stop asking questions. Before his army surged into Persia, he famously held grand feasts, some of them lavish enough to make seasoned warriors blink in disbelief. Mountains of roasted goat, dates glazed in wine, wheat cakes stuffed with dried fruits, and gold cups, always the gold cups. His army adored him. And why wouldn't they? The man practically gave them cheese and beer in exchange for loyalty. During his military campaigns, food was distributed according to strict codes. His soldiers were often given bread, wine, and meat before batala, last supper of sorts, except it doubled as a PR event. The bread represented stability, the wine, divine favor, the meat, well, that's how you let someone know you're serious about winning. Soldiers were seated by rank, by favor, by who had impressed him lately. Suddenly, your stomach forgets how nervous your brain is. Your hands grip the edge of the table instead of your sword. For a moment, the fear is wrapped in cinnamon and garlic. And make no mistake, this isn't about generosity. It's theater. Because in the ancient world, food was more than survival. It was symbolism. Let's go back a few thousand years and follow these feasts, not just the meals, but the meaning behind them. Picture Alexander the Great, whose reputation wasn't just forged on the battlefield, but also across banquet halls. It wasn't just dinner. It was a master class in soft power. A soldier might fight to protect a homeland, but he'll fight twice as hard to protect a leader who made him feel important, or even just a little bit full. And he wasn't alone in this. This brings us to a strange kind of battlefield calculus. Some emperors were better at this than others. Take Emperor Septimius Severus, who famously boosted troop loyalty by doling out frequent bonuses, often in the form of banquets or increased food allowances. And let's not forget Charlemagne, who understood that feeding his men was part spiritual duty, part imperial branding. Across the world, in feudal Japan, the practice had its own twist. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, military commanders often took inspiration from religious customs when distributing food. There's a kind of psychological brilliance in all of this. Let's not skip over the darker side, though. Sometimes, these banquets were the final goodbye. In some cultures, these meals became warriors in Celtic tribes, for example, were known to share a communal meal before heading into battle. And in ancient India, according to some records, Kshatriya warriors might share clarified butter ghee-infused foods, believed to imbue strength and divine protection. In a slightly stranger twist, some rituals involved eating symbolic parts of animals associated with power, like lions, bulls, or even eagles. Back in Europe, Certain commanders understood that propaganda came in courses, and the effect wasn't lost on the troops. Of course, we'd be remiss not to mention the flip side. Punishment through hunger. Yes, food could be weaponized in the other direction too. You don't need a whip when you've got humiliation in a wooden bowl. Let's pause for a moment. Breathe. Imagine a campfire again. Close your eyes. If you haven't already, you're not just being fed. You're being recruited again emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. Feasting, you see, wasn't about calories. It was about communion, power, promise, and sometimes propaganda served hot. By the time the dust settled, the groans of the wounded replaced the clatter of shields, and the battlefield no longer smelled only of blood but of churned up earth and sweat-soaked leather. There came a moment of strange silence, a lull, a space, where warriors, stretched thin by the brutality of combat, realized they were still alive. And after the horror came hunger, not the simple hunger of skipped meals, but the ravenous, wild-eyed appetite of those who had brushed against death and come back with their hearts still thudding in their ribs. It wasn't unusual for the victorious, sometimes even the defeated, to turn almost immediately toward feasting. The logic of this moment was as ancient as it was visceral. Conquer, then consume. Survive, then devour. And so, in the aftermath of violence, came the morbid menu. Imagine a Roman legion after a drawn-out siege. The city finally falls. Fires smolder in alleyways, and terrified citizens surrender what little they have. Soldiers pour into villas, temples, and marketplaces, some dragging carts, others simply their hands ready to grab whatever could be roasted, pickled, or swilled. What began as a military victory would quickly morph into a grotesque banquet. Were known to dine in full armor, spattered with ash and blood, crouching beside fires hastily built atop stone floors. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the stench of battle, the grease on their fingers still tinted with grime. But what were they eating? Sometimes lamb or goats seized from the countryside, other times dried meat looted from pantries, thrown into bubbling pots with stolen garlic, barley, and any aromatic herb foolish enough to grow near a fortress wall. But even stranger were the rituals that followed. It wasn't just about nourishment. It was about dominance, feasting in the very homes of their enemies. Drinking wine from seized goblets, or reclining on looted cushions while spitting olive pits onto broken mosaic floors. These were not polite dinner parties. They were celebrations of survival, displays of raw power, and sometimes strange theater. Take the Mongol armies under Genghis Khan, for example. Their campaigns were swift, brutal, and efficient, and, when victory was certain, they celebrated with food as wild as their warfare. There are tales, possibly exaggerated and yet hard to dismiss entirely, of commanders feasting in conquered palaces, toasting one another with fermented mare's milk, and making public meals of enemy livestock while singing war chants. One popular story even suggests that a defeated ruler's silverware would be used for the victor's first meal after conquest, as if to say, even your cutlery obeys us now. And then, the bizarre those feasts that blurred the lines between triumph and terror. Among the Scythians, a warrior culture feared for its brutality, there were persistent rumors of drinking from the skulls of the slain. Was it symbolic? A trophy? A twisted way of saying, I've devoured your power? We may never know for certain, but what is clear is that in some cultures, post-battle feasting could involve relics from the dead, not just jewelry or swords, but body parts. Creepy, absolutely. But to them, it was spiritual, perhaps even sacred. A gruesome communion. Then there's the story of Timurra, the mighty Tamerlane, after defeating cities in Persia and Central Asia, was known to throw enormous banquets. Roasted lambs by the dozen, rice pilafs glistening with fat trays of dried fruits soaked in honey, but alongside all the indulgence came the macabre. The banquet grounds surrounded by pyramids of skulls, reminders of the fallen. One had to wonder, did the meat taste different, eaten under the gaze of the dead? Even in more civilized settings, the line between celebration and savagery remained thin. In medieval Europe, after large battles like Agincourt or the Crusader sieges, the noble classes would host massive banquets for the victorious roasted swan. Pies shaped like castles, meats stuffed with other meats until the entire dish resembled a culinary matryoshka doll. Wine flowed freely, and entertainers spun stories while the blood on armor hadn't fully dried. Feasting, in these contexts, was layered with meaning. It wasn't just a way to restore calories, it was psychological release. A moment to breathe, to laugh, to cry, to drink, until the sword hand trembled not from fear but from wine. Some warriors reported that the meals after battle tasted more vivid than any other time in their lives. Every flavor was sharp, every texture exaggerated. Perhaps it was shock, perhaps it was joy, or maybe, just maybe, that closeness to death made life's simplest pleasures roar like thunder. Let's not forget the Vikings, our favorite connoisseurs of carnage. After raids, they partied hard. Mead in horned cups? No, not historically accurate horns. But we're dreaming here. Legs of lamb gripped in bare hands, and firelight flickering off braided beards and scarred cheeks. The sagas speak of these gatherings as sacred. A skald would sing, a seeress might whisper predictions over a pot of fish stew, and the chieftains would declare new laws between bites of smoked seal. But what about those darker whispers, those tales of cannibalism on desperate battlefields? Sadly, they're not all fantasy. During sieges, especially prolonged ones, food ran out. Starving defenders or invaders sometimes turned to the unthinkable. In the siege of Mara during the First Crusade, some chroniclers claimed that Crusaders resorted to cannibalism. Whether true or exaggerated by enemies or historians trying to shock, these stories stuck. They became part of the legend, grim and unforgettable. Now, contrast that with quieter moments. A Roman centurion sipping watered wine by the glow of a half-burned torch, his shield used as a table. Or a samurai unwrapping rice balls after battle. The sticky grains, a silent reminder of home. These smaller feasts, humble, perhaps even reverence, peak volumes to P. Not every warrior wanted a throne of bones. Some just wanted peace. Across Africa, warriors of the Zulu or Ashanti tribes also held intricate feasting rituals. Meat was shared communally, with specific portions reserved for leaders and warriors who distinguished themselves. The meal itself was a retelling of the battle, who fought bravely, who fell, who would be sung about tomorrow. The food wasn't just eaten, it was witnessed, celebrated, and remembered. And let's not forget the psychological toll. Many of these warriors suffered from what we'd now call PTSD. They didn't have therapists, but they had feasts. Food, wine, stories, and camaraderie were their group therapy. A roasted goat could mean more than meat. It was survival made edible. It was reassurance that, for now, the worst was over. Picture a fire crackling under a vast desert sky, warriors ringed around it, some speaking, others silent, one plucking at a simple lute or drum. A pot boils, steam rising with the aroma of spiced lentils and dried beef. Someone laughs, someone else weeps. The food makes its way around. This is more than dinner. It's a ceremony of healing. Sometimes the menu was symbolic. Among the Celts, ritual feasts involved specific animal sacrifices, and consuming them was a spiritual duty. To eat the boar was to consume its courage. To drink from the ceremonial cup was to link your soul to your tribe. The food wasn't fuel, it was transformation. In Mesoamerica, among the Aztecs, warriors would often return to the temples, where food was offered to the gods in thanks. Sometimes they'd partake of ritual meals that mirrored those offerings: maize cakes, chilies, cacao, and the lines between what the gods received and what the warriors consumed blurred. Every bite was a whisper to the divine. Even in the quiet aftermath of small skirmishes, food took on symbolic weight. A Greek hoplite might share olives and cheese with his companion, tearing the bread in half like a sacrament. And in that silence, in that simple breaking of bread, they found a bit of humanity again. So, whether it was a grand banquet in a looted hall, a makeshift stew in a muddy trench, or a single sip of victory wine from a stolen cup post-battle, eating was never just. Eating, it was mourning, celebration, statement, survival. Each bite told a story. The battlefield never could. And, as we leave the smoky ring of warriors, full-bellied and hollow-eyed, let the embers dim and the taste of roasted lamb and bitter wine fade. The battle may be over, but the memory lingers, savory, strange, and steeped in blood and fire. And so, with the last of the victory feast flickering away beneath torches and stars, we step out of the echoing halls and back into the dust-covered road. There's little time to savor roasted meat when a kingdom calls or an empire marches. Our warriors, tired but dutiful, once again tighten the straps on their armor, lace up their sandals, and slip stale bread into their satchels. Now begins a quieter chapter in the warriors' culinary life, the meals eaten not in celebration, but in motion. Let us wander together into the endless marches across desolate plains, frozen hillsides, and scorching deserts, where food was not a luxury or an expression of camaraderie, but sheer necessity. Let's talk about eating on the move. Those peculiar, makeshift meals taken in motion by some of history's most hardened fighters. Meals shared with saddle sores, sunburns, blisters, and blistering winds. If the post-battle feast was a reward, then this was the endurance test. A strange blend of survival, ingenuity, and just enough flavor to stop morale from collapsing like a poorly built siege tower. Picture the Roman legionnaire, his sandals chafing against sunburned calves as he marches along a dusty road stretching beyond the horizon. His helmet glints under the Mediterranean sun. On his back, a load of nearly 90 pounds. Weapons, tent poles, cookware and a curious ration known as hardtack. A brick-like slab of baked wheat, so hard you could use it to patch a wall. The trick was to soak it in posca sour mix of vinegar and water until it softened into something vaguely edible. If you're wondering, yes, that was lunch. Often dinner, too. Sometimes, Roman soldiers would grind grains into a sort of mash using a portable mortar and pestle. Boil it over a fire when possible, and season it with whatever foraged herbs or leftover pork fat they might have. Not exactly Roman cuisine. As the emperors knew it, marching through unfamiliar territory, they had to be clever. Their iron rations included dried figs, salted meat, and wheels of hard cheese. Salt, above all, was sacred. It kept meat from rotting, prevented dehydration, and added flavor to otherwise flavorless mush. The word salary even comes from the Latin salarium originally, the money given to soldiers to buy salt. Now imagine a Mongol horse archer galloping across the Eurasian steppe. He might go days without stopping for a formal meal. His food travelled with him, literally strapped to his saddle. There, he kept fermented mare's milk rags, loshing around in leather flasks. There were balls of dried curds, so hard they had to be sucked on like jawbreakers, and dried meataphon, horse meat that was chewed slowly, warmed between tongue and cheek as he rode. Some Mongols were known to make soup in their helmets. Seriously, when camp was struck, they'd clean out their iron helms, fill them with water, toss in dried meat and wild onions, and let it simmer over a fire. Dinner in a hat served hot. Born A.P. Petty onward to medieval Europe, where knights and footmen faced their own stomach-rumbling struggles. On the march, they'd carry dried fruits, nuts, hunks of black rye bread, and strips of smoked pork. Occasionally, they made soldiers. Porridge, a thick oat mixture stirred in communal pots, spiced with whatever was available, sometimes garlic, sometimes grass. In moments of relative peace, mess kits came out. Tin pots rattled over small fires, and spoons carved from bone or wood scraped the bottom of pots filled with watery stew. But often, there wasn't time for fires. Bread and cheese became the go-to, stuffed in pouches or tied to belts. Meat was wrapped in leaves, buried under saddles, and pressed flat as horses galloped miles a day. Some warriors baked bread on their shields. Really, flat dough, spread across a sun-warmed iron shield, then turned and toasted until edible. There's a strange poetry in eating bread off the very object meant to protect your life. Sometimes, these marching meals took surreal turns. Vikings might chew on dried seaweed for minerals. Crusaders trudging through the Holy Land, date pits for hydration and energy. Some carried candied ginger to stave off nausea. Others, in colder climates, stuffed hunks of dried lard into fur-lined satchels to soften it. With body heat before biting into it, let us not forget the helmet stew tale of the Polish hussars. While it may border on folklore, it's whispered that, on especially long marches, they made soup by boiling broth in their winged helmets. Whether true or not, the image sticks. Warriors sipping broth from the same helm they wore into battle. Meal planning had its own strategy. Armies moved not just by foot or horse but by food supply. A starving army was a defeated one. Generals factored grain routes, foraging opportunities, and river crossings not just for tactics, but for food. And so, cooks became as vital as commanders. Spoiled meat could kill faster than an arrow. And what of water? In many cases, it wasn't trusted. Rivers could carry disease, especially downstream of an encampment. So water was often flavored or soured, turning into vinegar drinks, or weak beer. Even children drank it. Not to get drunk, but because it was safer than plain water. But meals became memory. That handful of raisins on the 9th day of a march, that could be a blessing. A boiled egg shared between friends. A sign of deep camaraderie. In a world where luxuries vanished with distance, the smallest bite became sacred, and yet, despite the hardship, warriors developed habits. Morning routines with dried bread dipped in broth. Evening circles around a fire where cold hands warmed. Overshared rations. Stories traded with bites. Jokes carved from hunger. The same terrible stew, night after night, became a strange comfort. You knew what to expect even if it tasted like boiled boot. Let's not pretend all meals were grim. When the weather was kind, the terrain generous, and the enemy far off, the campfire brought joy. Herbs gathered during the day found their way into stew. A fresh Keeler rabbit, pheasant, or fish transformed the pot. Bread might be baked, mead shared. For a moment, the road felt like home. And yet, even in joy, danger loomed. Spoiled food was a real threat. Clostridium botulinum, a bacterium that thrived in poorly preserved meat, could cause paralysis or death. Some warriors died not in battle, but from what they ate on the way to it. Still, they ate. They moved, they fought, and they carried with them a kind of culinary resilience that modern adventurers might envy. The ability to find nourishment in a handful of cheese, a spoon of porridge, a cup of sour wine. So, tonight, as you rest, picture that quiet camp, the wind hushing over grasslands, the low crackle of a fire, a circle of tired warriors passing, a battered pot between them, stirring in whatever scraps they'd gathered, the smell of garlic, broth, and something faintly charred, laughter, perhaps, or silence, the hush of a world preparing for another day on the move. They ate what they made do, and in those modest meals, marching toward the unknown, they carved out moments of peace spoon by spoon, bite by bite. You see, warrior food wasn't just about filling bellies or showing off loot. For many ancient soldiers, what they attained, what they refused to eat, was deeply wrapped up in superstition, mysticism, and ritual. Eating was not merely an act of survival, it was a performance of power, of belief, of magic. Let's start with a peculiar tale from the dusty sands of the Roman Empire, home to one of the most bizarre protein drinks in ancient history. You've heard of gladiators, those fierce fighters of the Colosseum. Muscles gleaming, sand stuck in their beards, cheers of thousands echoing off the marble. But did you know their recovery drink of choice may have been, wait for it, yes, actual ash, ground up charcoal and plant ash mixed with water or vinegar, lovingly dubbed gladiators tonic by modern scholars. Why? Because it was believed that this drink restored the body's humors, balanced inner fires, and helped mend bones after a fight. They believed ash cooled the blood and soothed the stomach. Did it work? Well, possibly not. But if you were getting smacked around with a spiked mace every week, you might drink whatever your trainer handed you. Meanwhile, across the globe in feudal Japan, the samurai upheld a different set of culinary convictions. Garlic and onions, to kitchen staples we now sought with abandon, were avoided like curses. These pungent plants were believed to stir up base passions and cloud the warrior's noble mind. A samurai had to be composed, dignified, and above the common chaos of the senses. So no garlicky ramen before battle. Thank you very much. Instead, their diets focused on rice, pickled vegetables, miso soup, and fish. Clean, disciplined, serene, like a tea ceremony served with a side of swordsmanship. But beneath this discipline pulsed something deeper, a spiritual link between what one consumed and who one became. To eat simply was to cultivate harmony with Enand, perhaps. To avoid belching in one's helmet, the ancient Celts, those warriors of the forests and hills, had their own ideas. Some believed in eating the hearts of brave enemies to inherit their courage. It sounds dramatic, like something from a metal album cover. But stories abound in ancient chronicles of warriors who believed the power of a defeated foe could pass through blood and flesh into their own bones. Of course, modern historians debate whether this was actual practice or just juicy Roman propaganda to paint their enemies as savage. But the myth held fast. Even today, we carry shadows of it in phrases like lion-hearted or gut instinct. There's a lingering idea that the essence of strength can be swallowed whole if you're bold enough. The Zulu warriors of southern Africa, known for their battle prowess under leaders like Shaka Zulu, held strong beliefs about meat and masculinity. A warrior's strength was thought to be connected to his diet, meat being the core of male vigor. Some rituals forbade warriors from consuming certain animals seen as weak or passive. Instead, they sought the energy of fierce beasts, cattle, Wild game, even lions. But not just any piece would do. Organs had meanings. The liver might represent courage, the heart symbolized bravery, and eating the brain, though rare, was sometimes tied to wisdom or spiritual connection. These weren't snacks. These were sacred ceremonies in edible form. Now, let's revisit the Norse people, for whom every meal was laced with folklore. Viking warriors didn't just eat to live. They ate to become. Boar was a favored feast, especially during Yule, and it wasn't just about the meat. Boars were sacred to the god Freyr, and devouring one at a feast was seen as taking in his fertility and strength. Before major battles, some sagas describe rituals involving those mushrooms, likely Amanita muscaria, the infamous red-capped hallucinogen. Consumed by berserkers before battle, these fungi didn't just intoxicate, they transformed. Legends say they caused men to howl, foam at the mouth, and feel no pain. Whether that was literal or exaggerated by terrified enemies is unclear, but the belief was real. To eat the right thing was to become more than human. Even Christian knights weren't immune to food-based faith. Bread and wine weren't just rations, they were transformed through ritual into the body and blood of Christ. A warrior might ride into battle carrying a blessed loaf, believing it would protect him from arrows. Holy water wasn't just for church, it might be sprinkled on meals to purify them before a dangerous campaign. This mix of the sacred and the digestive was everywhere. Food was a metaphor, a medium, and a message. Every bite had meaning. Every recipe held a memory. Sometimes warriors fasted before a battle not because they lacked food, but because they believed entering combat hungry sharpened their instincts. Hunger, they thought, brought them closer to the divine, or at least made them less likely to vomit mid-swing. Let's not forget the ancient Greeks, who loved their symbolism almost as much as they loved olives. Before Olympic-style warrior competitions, athletes would consume figs and honey, believing it boosted performance and divine favor. Meanwhile, certain fish like the red mullet were avoided because they were believed to contain nervous energies that could unbalance the spirit. And in the distant reaches of the Middle East, Mamluk warriors were known to drink concoctions brewed from dates, spices, and camel milk fortified with ingredients said to give a man the courage of 10. Their food was part sustenance, part incantation. It's tempting to roll our eyes, to think, oh, those silly medieval minds and their magical meatballs. But pause a moment. Don't we still do it? Athletes today have their rituals, superstitions, special meals before games, lucky snacks, no carbs before marathons, or one banana exactly 30 minutes before liftoff. We haven't really changed. We've just given our magical thinking a scientific facelift. Protein shakes now wear labels instead of incantations. But the core belief is the same, that what you eat becomes who you are. And somewhere deep down, many of us still believe that the right snack could make us braver, faster, stronger, or at least less cranky in traffic. So, the next time you see someone crushing a raw egg before a workout or refusing garlic before a date, remember the warriors of old. Remember the ash-drinking gladiators, the samurai sipping broth, the berserkers tripping on mushrooms, the Zulu honoring meat, the Greeks avoiding suspicious seafood. They all believed, with fierce sincerity, that their food was their fate, that courage could be chewed, that destiny could be swallowed. And maybe, in the glow of that flickering campfire surrounded by murmured prayers, sharpened blades, and grumbling stomachs, they weren't entirely wrong. Now, as the flames dim and the night settles once again over the old battlefield, let that thought carry you softly toward sleep. That for all our differences across centuries and cultures, we've always looked to our plates with hope. Hope for strength. Hope for magic. Hope to be just a little more than we were before. And isn't that, after all, the most human superstition of all? Let's linger for a moment in the gentle afterglow of centuries of feasting, fasting, chewing, cooking, and conquering. We've walked alongside warriors across windswept deserts and snowy ridges, listened to their stomachs rumble before battle, peeked into their camp kitchens, and watched as they toasted victory with goblets, horns, and sometimes soup ladled from helmets. We've heard their beliefs, swallowed their odd concoctions, and shivered a little at their superstitions. But now, with the battlefield far behind us, and the embers of ancient fires fading into smoke, it's time to ask, what became of all this? What traces of warrior cuisine still linger in our modern world? You might be surprised, because they're everywhere. Hidden in your pantry, whispering through the aisles of your local grocery store, wearing modern packaging, but bearing the bones of ancient ideas. Take the protein bar, for instance. A tidy little brick of calories, marketed as a fuel source for busy modern gladiators, juggling meetings and gym sessions. But, at its core, it's just a cousin of Roman hardtack, that tooth-breaking, flour and water survival biscuit carried by legionnaires on dusty roads from Gaul to Jerusalem. Sure, our bars have peanut butter and cocoa nibs, but they still promised the same thing: strength in a wrapper, endurance in a bite, or bone broth. Marketed now as a collagen-rich, gut-healing elixir, sipped by wellness influencers and crossfitters. It's nothing new. Ancient warriors, from Mongols to Norsemen, simmered animal bones for hours, over campfires, not for the hashtag, but for the marrow, minerals, and soul-soothing warmth. What we now sell in sleek glass jars was once ladled from soot-blackened pots in wind-swept encampments. And what about beer, mead, wine? Today we sip them at festivals or breweries. But the atmosphere, the long wooden tables, the shared songs, the roasted meats is a direct descendant of the mead hall, the warrior's dining room, the place where stories were told, oaths were made, and reputations were toasted into legend. Even the word toast comes from this tradition. In Roman times, a small piece of toasted bread was dropped into wine in its hand, then eaten at the end. Over time, the act of drinking to someone's health became associated with this ritual. So, when you raise your glass today, you're echoing the hands of warriors who did the same by torchlight. But let's go further. Modern militaries still issue rations, often in vacuum-sealed pouches with carefully calculated calories. They're the children of medieval field meals, foods designed to last, to survive transport, and to nourish under stress. They might not contain dried yak, fat, or fermented horse milk anymore. But the principle hasn't changed. Longevity, efficiency, fuel. And then there's the aesthetic of warrior food. It's everywhere. Think about all those fitness programs or influencer diets that speak in terms of conquest. Eat like a Viking. Go primal. Unleash your inner beast. It's a marketing goldmine. It all traces back to the same core idea that what ancient warriors ate gave them their strength, their edge, their glory. The paleo diet, it's less about actual Paleolithic accuracy and more about channeling the imagined toughness of our ancestors. No grains, no processed junk, just the meat, nuts, and roots of a wild warrior past. It's not just a diet. It's a costume for the soul, dressing up modern anxiety in fur and fire. But behind the glossy fitness slogans and warrior detox regimens lies a more touching truth. We are still, somehow, yearning to connect with something ancient, something brave, something enduring. When we bite into a flame-grilled steak or sip a mug of broth, we're not just feeding ourselves, we're feeding a story. It's the same story that echoed in Mongol yurts, Greek mess halls, Zulu kraals, and Viking longhouses. That food is identity, that food is memory, that food is meaning. And we see it even in the rituals we didn't expect. The last meal tradition before an execution. Its roots stretch into the warrior's final feast before battle, a way to honor the transition from life to death, from struggle to stillness. The way we eat together at weddings, funerals, and graduations. It mirrors the warrior's belief that to break bread together was to form a bond stronger than steel. Even the modern custom of meal prep, lining up little plastic containers for the week ahead, is a faint echo of the marching meals and saddle. Snacks packed by soldiers who didn't know where the road would lead, but knew they'd need fuel to get there. Of course, not all warrior food was noble. Some of it was ridiculous, disgusting, dangerous. We laugh at the fermented fish and the sheep's blood stew and the raw liver breakfast sand. Rightly so. But even there's a strange kind of beauty. A reminder that the human stomach is one of history's most stubborn survivors. And that where there's hunger, there's creativity. And so, we end not with a bang, but with a chew. Because, in the end, food, especially the food of warriors, isn't just about war. It's about what happens before and after. It's about the moments of humanity amidst the violence. The quiet chewing beside a campfire, the passing of a waterskin, the joke over burnt bread, the reverence in a shared meal. Those things endure. They ripple into our present. So the next time you eat something sturdy and strange, something passed down or packaged up in ancient confident sport somewhere, a long line of warriors just nodded in approval.